I'd never seen a day turn so dark so fast. I've heard of the eternal winters of the north, where the sun doesn't shine for 6 whole months. I didn't imagine darkness could be this terrifying. You see, I've never been afraid of the dark. When I was a kid, I read Stephen King books in the dark, equipped with only a flashlight and my courage. I read through publications such as Jessie, Pet Sematary, It, and several others I was arguably way too young to read. It didn't matter. I devoured those books, gave myself a good spook, and slept as soundly as any other child. I've always loved horror, the scary, the nasty, the downright evil. And yet, nothing had ever brought a shiver down my spine like that strange blob of smoke and ashes I saw when I woke up in the morning. I'd barely had the time to see the crack of dawn that the sky covered in a thick black cloud. I got out on my patio and stared at the sky, awestruck and terrified. My blood turned ice cold at the sight of those tendrils of darkness coming out of the cloud. They swayed in the wind, hovering from Johnsonburg, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. I had no idea what the hell this thing was, but my every instinct was on high alert, telling me to leave town as soon as I could. My wife soon joined me on the balcony, her fingers white as they held tightly on the handle of her cup. Her lips parted in surprise, and I saw her face pale, brown eyes widening upon the sight of the cloud. She uttered a small, "The fuck was that?" under her breath, and I was half tempted to bring her back inside, but I didn't. I could see most of our neighbors were also looking at it, either from their patio or straight up standing on their front lawn. Now, I wish I could say the cloud passed and moved to another town, but it didn't. Instead, it grew, and streaks of red lightning seemed to fill it. It crackled with unparalleled energy. I could feel my hair stand on end despite the tendrils not even close to reaching my house. I lived on the edge of Johnsonburg when that fateful day happened, and I still remember the horror of the day as it was yesterday. I remember how I felt hopeful when the army and the feds started filling the streets of our small town. And I remember how whatever hope I had was crushed when the tendrils started moving with intent. Because up until now, the blob only looked like an angry thunder cloud with tendrils. It didn't have a conscience. It was made of smoke, ashes, and fire-hot lightning. When it started growing and its tendrils started targeting the army and feds, I felt in the very marrow of my bones that our efforts would all be in vain. The tendrils' attacks were relentless. They struck through armored tanks, breaking them as if they were made of paper, then lifted them to be absorbed into the cloud. It grew bigger with each vehicle and soul it ingested, and I heard my wife's cup shatter to pieces as it fell to the ground, and her cold, moist hand as it grabbed mine. I pulled her close and got back inside the house. But we stayed by the large bay window. No matter how much we wanted to take our keys and run, we realized there would be no escape. The blob and its tendrils were now attacking randomly, allowing inside its mass even more vehicles. I could hear the scream of soldiers in the distance as they fired at the cloud uselessly, as if bullets would be enough to stop that thing. I held tight onto my wife, and I saw the last of the army and feds being sucked into the cloud, and a deafening silence followed for about 12 seconds. I didn't count, but it felt horrifyingly long, even if I knew not a lot of time had passed. A blood-curdling metallic cacophony reverberated through Johnsonburg, and I felt my heart rise in my throat. It sounded like the cloud was mashing the vehicles together in its insides, twisting and breaking metal. Each screech of steel scratching steel had my spine quivering, and I felt something warm against my chest. My wife had started crying, and all I could do was stand there in horror, my eyes fixed on that glowing red and black mass. The plaintive, metallic noises rooted me in the spot for another 5 minutes, and I felt bugs crawling under my skin, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. I was so terrified that my entire body refused to listen to me and my desire to hide. Once the cloud was done screaming, it rained. Not little drops of water to rinse off the fear. It rained blood and pieces of bones and flesh, dismembered bodies and broken military outfits. It rained whatever that thing didn't desire. It seemed like it didn't feed on flesh and blood, but it had no qualms eating everything else. It rained red and stained my windows. That's when I realized that the cloud had gotten so big it was now over my house too. Johnsonburg was now entirely covered by darkness. The only thing keeping it alit, the few lampposts programmed to follow the sun. A deep, scratchy sound soon resonated. The tendrils moved aimlessly as they did before the army and feds came. For a few seconds, I surprised myself, hoping whatever it was had fed enough, that it would move on to the next town now it ate an entire army. And I could see the streets and roofs in the distance, most of them covered in blood and entrails. I saw the discarded, mangled bodies as close as my neighbor's front lawn. They were spat back to the ground because they served no purpose to the blob. They were simply in the wrong vehicle at the wrong moment. It seemed I wasn't the only one thinking the thing might have fed enough. I heard car doors slamming left and right and dashed to my patio. I nearly slipped on the blood, but managed to grab the rail in time. And I shouted, "Don't go!" as my neighbor, who was packing his wife and kids in his minivan. And, well, to this day, I wish he'd listened to me. Even my wife took her keys and begged me to get into the car. The streets filled up in minutes, and that weird, deep crackling from the cloud started again. I remember screaming at everyone to get out of their car until I felt like my vocal cords would burst. I remember the pain in my throat as I tried to scream louder than the car horns blaring. But it was too late. It was too late the moment people turned on their car engine and reanimated that steel-eating energy blob hunger. Its tendrils lashed out again, this time at the cars of friends, neighbors, and other scared townsfolk. I fell on my knees as I saw the gray minivan of my neighbor being lifted into the sky. I saw his wife open the passenger door and throw herself outside, but it was too late. The tendrils were so fast that she was already a couple of 100 feet in the air. She cracked on top of the grocery store, and despite the noise, I'm convinced I heard as her body broke to bits against the concrete roof. I felt my heart rise in my throat, and this time, I couldn't hold myself back. I leaned forward and hurled as cars were hoisted up by those tentacles made of darkness and energy. The sky turned red once more as the vehicles were mixing in that thing's stomach, if it even had one. The cloud glowed far brighter this time, a red I'd never seen before, and it almost blinded me. My wife wrapped her arms around my shoulders and brought me back inside. And for now, it hadn't attacked homes, only vehicles, and only those that were turned on. Cars parked in the street had been left alone. I barely had the time to close the door, then I heard it. The resounding thumps of bodies falling. A head broke our window and my wife screamed. I couldn't even recognize the person it belonged to. Johnsonburg is a small town. We probably knew that person. And yet, its face had been so mangled, we couldn't identify it. Half of the skin was missing, revealing bones, broken teeth, and a tongue covered in blood. The cut on the neck wasn't clean either. On my front porch, half a torso broke the railing of my patio. Its chest had been sliced through, and I could see the broken ribs poking through the skin on the other side. Guts spilled from the cavity on the abdomen, staining my balcony crimson. The scent was as foul as you would expect. If I hadn't emptied my stomach earlier, I would have done so again. This time, it was my wife that ran to the kitchen sink. I only heard the splatter and felt all strength leaving me. I was convinced I was going to die, even if I felt safe in my home because the thing had yet to attack any residences. I didn't know how long it would last. For all I knew about that blob, once it was done feeding on all the town's cars, it would try to destroy buildings to find more of what it needed. At this moment, I thought we should run. That my wife and I should just take our legs and run to the next town and ask for help there. It was impossible to think they hadn't seen the cloud, but with the army gone, I had a feeling we would be left to ourselves until new help came. I didn't want to take the risk of running and being grabbed by one of those tendrils. I felt that if I stayed in my home, I would eventually die. The stench of blood and gore was thick in the air, now that our window was broken and dismembered bodies littered our lawn. But we had no other choice. My wife returned from the kitchen, lips bitten red and face as pale as Snow White. I'd never seen her look so terrified in her life, but she probably thought the same as she looked at me. Tears streaked down her face continuously, but my eyes were dry. One of us needed to stay strong. I stood up from the ground and grabbed her hand firmly, hoping I could be a little reassuring for her. I couldn't hear a noise coming from outside. The tendrils were swaying back and forth as if carried by the wind. The attack had stopped. The rain of bodies and blood had also come to a halt. It was now or never. I heard someone start a motorcycle, and I ran toward the door. When my hand wrapped around the handle, I heard a scream and something crashing onto my patio again. The man screamed help at me through the door, and I couldn't see him. My wife stepped back and wailed as I debated opening the door. The man on the other side slammed his fist on the door and asked for help again, this time a lot weaker. I opened the door a few seconds too late. I saw a man's body lying on my porch. The man's lower half had been ripped from the waist down. It made me feel sick to my stomach. It was most likely the guy who tried to flee on his motorcycle. When the cloud felt it, it sent a tendril at him and literally separated him from his bike. I don't know how he stayed awake long enough to scream for help and bang on my door, but only a half a man was lying in a puddle of viscera and blood in front of me. I could see his legs a few feet away, and I closed the door instinctively. Even if we ran, we would end up like this. I heard screaming in the background as people still desperately attempted to run away, and I grabbed my wife. I held her tight as we both fell on our knees to the ground. I put my hand on the back of her head and kept her face in my chest while I turned to gaze at the sky. That blob was even bigger now. Nobody was using their vehicles anymore, but I saw people running down the streets. The creature probably felt the movement below, and it started lashing out. Its tendrils moved with accurate precision as it slammed on buildings, forcing debris to fall on people running away. I could only watch as my town was destroyed. I don't know what anchored the blob, but it looked absolutely wild at this point. Its tendrils were going berserk in our town. Houses and businesses alike were targeted, and so I grabbed my wife and I ran outside. Seconds later, one of those tendrils slammed on my roof of our home and split it in two. I could see the spot where we knelt on had been destroyed. A few more seconds inside, and we would have been dead meat. The blob's attack sped up. It thrashed about frantically as if desperate to make as much damage as possible. I watched as the tendril started to dissolve into thin air, and I wondered what was happening. The first ray of sunshine caressed me and my wife's cheeks as the darkness seemed to dissipate. I watched, terrified that it would come back even stronger to finish us off. But it didn't. It kept rampaging until every last inch of smoke and ash was swallowed into thin air, vanishing as if it had never existed. I stood in the middle of debris and gore with my wife, relieved and terrified. This time, I ran into the house, grabbed our keys, and left. Our luck was that our car remained untouched, even in the final onslaught. I turned the car on and felt a sick thinking that it might grab us, but it was now or never. My wife turned the radio on, and we drove until we heard the newscaster voice talking about the cloud. It came to us because a bunch of kids found an obelisk buried in the woods, about 25 miles north of Johnsonburg. The voice explained that when it came into contact with the sun, it awoke the cloud of death. Even they confirmed that the obelisk had been broken with a sledgehammer. But I wasn't going back to Johnsonburg even if they paid me. The news finished with a message inviting anyone to report and destroy any obelisk they find, to avoid another Johnsonburg situation from happening. I had a feeling this wasn't over, but I sincerely hoped for my wife and me that we would not be there next time.